first allow my fellow panelists to appear on stage. Joining me, next to me is Gina, Gill, and we have Pedro, Tavares. Before I give a further introduction, let me introduce quickly myself. I'm indeed research director at the Hague Institute for Innovation of Law, which is working here in The Hague on delivering justice systematically, rigorously. How can we ensure that people-centered justice is actually happening? That is needed, we feel, in The Hague, in this city of peace and justice. Justice systems are not in a terribly good shape. We saw last week the Rule of Law Index appearing, and that showed that the rule of law declined in 61% of countries last year. And the patterns we see, there's more order on the streets, but less civil justice, less criminal justice, and less protection of fundamental rights in the world. And we see increasingly that the problem is in the procedures that have to enable solutions for people, for the billions of justice problems that appear each year in the world. We see that these procedures are overburdened, delayed, often too complex, and often not financially sustainable. And the beginning of an answer to that access to justice crisis seems to be people-centered justice. It is a term proposed by the OECD. You see it developing at the UN level. You see it in development aid programs on rule of law. And the basic idea is to start from the problems people experience, whether they have issues or conflicts about land, about work, in their family, crime, of course, living together in crowded cities. These are the problems people experience. And then the idea is to work from data, focus on outcomes people need to move on with their lives, because that is maybe the essence of doing justice, enabling people to move on with their lives, repairing their often very difficult, strained relationships. People-centered justice means working more evidence-based, more at scale, of course, innovate, create an enabling regulatory environment. And of course, we need tech, we need JusticeTech. And we will explore this topic with two panelists, and we will talk about why this is important, but probably we have made the case already. How can we ensure that JusticeTech is people-centered and that it works for all citizens? First, Pedro Tavares, you're Secretary of State for Justice in Portugal. In the preparation for this meeting, you shared an amazing number of initiatives that you are taking. I want to pick out one issue. You said a lot of improvement comes from better communication, smart guides for people. Can you explain a little bit how you in Portugal are working on this?
Sure. Good morning, and thank you so much for being here. I would like to start on explaining that and hearing the first concern on the rule of law and making sure that, in fact, we do strengthen the rule of law and obviously the access of citizens to justice is making sure that, firstly, the barriers and the constraints are less. People do understand how can they access to justice. They do understand what justice is about, their rights, the costs of the justice, and how to access to all the services. So one of the things that we realize in many cases, being the justice system, for instance in Portugal, broad, sometimes it's difficult for people to understand where should they go. For instance, to get a divorce. People can go to a court, and obviously, depending the case, is something that they have to choose for, or they can choose an ADR solution, or they can even go to the registry. So right now, for instance, we just released last Friday a new service that allows people to get a divorce online using video conference and with authentication and document validation. Obviously, it was fostered by COVID, so we have that. In addition, what we're developing is a smart guide using machine learning, trying to make sure that people understand where should they go by using information. So these smart guides also help people to access the justice system.
Thank you. We'll explore this topic further and how they continue their journey in the justice system after being informed. Then, Gina, Gill, you're working as a Chief Digital and Information Officer in the English MOJ. And you come from the area of financial services and regulation of that field. You published a digital strategy for the MOJ in April, and you told me before the meeting that the crux of it is change the way how we work. Can you expound a bit on that?
Yeah, sure. So our strategy obviously talks about technology as well, but as we were talking about earlier, I think that technology is the easy part of change. The difficult part of change is changing the way that people think, the way that people work, the way that we design policy, the way that we think about the design of our services. You talked about, services that are designed around users. That's not necessarily the case today. And if I take financial services as an example, so I worked for, a couple of the big banks, and they changed things and they improved things and they introduced technology while I was there. So we went from phone banking to telephone banking, from branch banking to telephone banking to online banking. And those, there was real change for users in the way that they access services. But all of those services were designed within a framework, within an existing framework and an existing way of doing things, right? So they ended up designing a set of processes, digitizing a set of processes based on how they worked at that point in time. And they thought that they would never really have any new competition. Lloyd's competition is Barclays, Barclays competition is HSBC. And then along came fintech companies, and they said, hold on a second, if we don't think about banking regulation and we don't think about the other constraints that these organizations are placing on themselves, what does a user actually want from a banking service? How do we design a banking service that a user wants? How do we work with the regulator to then be able to actually provide that service? And that is the crux of how they've managed to break into a market that people thought was impenetrable.
And how in the justice sector it may be even more difficult and even more restrained by rules and traditions. If you compare the offices of banks and the offices of courts and the way people dress, so how can you make this move?
So it's. I think it's a combination of proving the point. You have to deliver small things that deliver real change to users to prove the point and demonstrate the benefit. But it's something that's not in 12 months' time we're going to have solved it. In 24 months' time we're going to have solved it. There are a lot of stakeholders who needs to be brought on that journey. So not only are we talking about our ministers and our senior leaders and then the people that write policy, we're also talking about judges and barristers and solicitors, all of who are used to working in a very certain way.
And you bring in digital teams in this environment, and then they sit next to other teams, and yeah, you explained this dynamics to me, and I would love to let the audience hear about this.
So in some of our most digitally mature parts of the organisation, we have a service owner that sits as part of the operational team, and they work with our digital teams, they work with our policy colleagues, and they work with other operational colleagues to deliver a service to a user. And that's where we're seeing real change happen. Like, we're simplifying policy, we're delivering services in a very different way to users. The organisation is structured differently than it was before. That's the kind of shining beacon for us, and we're now kind of using that to slowly shift mindsets in other parts of the organisation.
Yeah, Pedro, turning to your prior experience, you worked in the field of land registry, which is probably an example of an area of the justice system where there's a lot of tech already and a lot of scale. And now you enter this field of courts and lawyers and processes. Can you share how that works for you?
Sure. So prior to this experience, I work on a specific problem that we face in Portugal. That was most of the land, the rural land, was unknown, and 91% of the land is privately owned. So every time we had a forest fire, we didn't know how to contact even the landowners. So what we did was we developed a digital approach where landowners could go to an application and identify their lands and the configuration of their land. So we use machine learning algorithms, we use satellite, we use remote detection, all kinds of tools for people, even in nursing homes, could identify their lands. So it's really not about technology. It's making sure that the service is really easy to use and adds value to the citizens, protects their rights. That's why it's on the justice area. So what we're trying to bring is making these kind of approaches the same one in justice. Doing those for instance, on courts, making sure that people can access information. They know they have more transparency tools. For instance, now they can access and consult all the court cases online, and most of the court cases are accessed after the courts are closed. They can go to the registry and apply for simple registry acts, not because, for instance, the deadline of the document needs to be, they have to change, but because proactively the government really renewed everything automatically. So what we're trying to build is this kind of movement that involves, obviously, people. I think that's really the key part of it. But at the same part, the second part involves technology and processes. So change management is really important.
It's really great to see that the role of senior officers at Ministry of Justice is changing into change leaders and innovators. Both of you spoke a lot about startups, involving them in the process. Can you both probably address that issue? How can it work, startups in this justice sector, which is so full of institutions already? What is their place? How do you work with them?
So one of we've actually got a couple of services that we've scaled now that started as small pilots with, smaller organizations, small, medium type enterprises. So when COVID struck, we were experimenting with court video. We were experimenting with virtual prison visits. So, that's happening. COVID strikes. We think it's going to take a long time to convince people that we need to do virtual courts, or that we need to do virtual prison visits. And all of a sudden, the demand is there, right? Because the world changed overnight.
Brought in the startup?
So we worked with small organisations to actually then scale up those services.
Yeah.
So it was a great opportunity. I mean, we were talking just before we came out about about how do we create the space to be able to work more with SMEs within the kind of procurement frameworks that we have to operate in, right? But there's some brilliant ideas out there. I've seen some brilliant ideas out there, but it's about how we bring that to bear.
Have you thought already, Pedro, about the procurement problem? How can you let startups develop new stuff, but then also ensure that it's bought by the courts, by the government institutions in the justice sector?
Yeah, so I would say we need to work on both sides. So firstly, making sure you have the right framework. We have data, obviously, that people can work on. We have procurement options that allow these startups to work with us. And second, I think it is really important, our value proposition. It needs to be very clear, because sometimes when we think about startups, and that's why startups work with fintech, they work with a lot of areas, and they don't particularly work with the government, is because our value proposition, especially for justice, is not very clear. For instance, in Portugal, we're a small market, so why would someone work with us? So we need to communicate better. And the second thing is answering challenges. For instance, we had like 3 months ago, we're visiting a lot of areas. One of them was the registry, and I found out that we had 4 people that the only thing that they did was inventing names for companies, because we have this on-the-spot firm. And I said, this is something that we can automate easily, and someone can do that. So we work obviously with startups to automate and adds value, because not only we did that machine learning, but also it can propose the name for a company on a specific area. So it adds add value for the citizen. These kinds of projects are obviously expandable. We can go to other markets and really reuse them. So we need also to foster this kind of work done in collaboration with all the, obviously the startups, the associations, and internationally.
And just also to involve the audience here, there may be people here in the audience who are developing new processes for, what have you, divorce or restorative justice for regular crime. If they have developed a great online supported system, which is very people-centered, and they would offer it to your ministry, how would that process work?
For me, for us, it would start with a conversation about, what are the services. But ultimately, we have to go through some sort of public procurement process or some sort of framework. And actually, the use of frameworks in the UK can be quite helpful in terms of startups. So if we do have organisations that are on particular frameworks, then it's a bit faster for us to be able to work with them.
Yeah. And in Portugal, would you adopt it faster than it would be adopted in the UK?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I think obviously we need to set up that framework. We need to make sure that really we have the right tools for that. I think we're not there yet, but we're on the road to do that. I think we need to respond. Right now, we're still focusing on specific challenges. So what are the main problems for instance, for access of justice, making sure that people do use the services, or for the judges or prosecutors to also obviously are enablers of this kind of movement, or the public servants to be the owners of this change. So right now, these challenges need to be tackled. So this is the focus. But what I invite, obviously, is to meet other solutions, to meet other problems being solved, and because there's a lot of things to do still on the justice.
Yeah, there might be still a gap from how we innovate in the justice sector and how we do that in the healthcare sector or in other sectors. In the healthcare sector, as somehow the mechanism was such that we incentivized people to work on COVID vaccines, and they could be brought to the market in a systematic way, tested, etc. And at Hill, we are dreaming of a system like that, so that the the engine for innovation would really really work here. If you look at this sector, do you feel it's more likely to grow by incremental change, or are disruptions really needed? What is your view on that?
Well, I would say it's both. It needs to be both. Firstly, because we have legacy. And legacy, obviously, it is a challenge, because we need at the same time continue the systems that we have. We need to evolve them. And at the same time, we need to be disruptive. For instance, the digital cadastre that I've mentioned. In some projects that tackle specific areas where we need to change completely the scenario. So we need to do both. But I would say that the other thing is making sure that we involve the stakeholders. Because, and Gina mentioned that, I think one of the main problems that we face is sometimes we do this change by decree, by the cabinet, being us being the ones that say we're changing that. If people don't see the change as their own, they won't follow it, and they don't do it, and they don't develop it. So I'll just show you, explain you briefly. Now we're doing a sort of executive education for all the directors and project managers and program managers on justice, on all bodies, including prosecutor's office, Supreme Courts, to make sure that they have the skills, business, obviously, change management, on leadership, on innovation, to make sure that obviously they understand what kind of resources, what kind of skills, what kind of challenges need to be addressed, so they feel as the change as their own. I think that this is something to do disruptive or incremental change. We need to make sure that people do understand what we're talking about. That's the first part.
It's certainly change. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Pedro. I think it has to be both. But I think, so today we are launching Digital Innovation Month at the Ministry of Justice. And this is our first session that we're live streaming. But basically it's a month about helping our operational colleagues understand what digital is, demystifying it a little bit, making them a little bit less scared about technology, but also helping them to understand the art of the possible. I mentioned this earlier. I was at a session with the leadership team of prisons in the UK, and they had a 2-hour session on what's the future of prisons. So let's start from a blank piece of paper. It's it's beyond 2030. Yeah. What does a prison look like? And two things struck me. One was, they enjoyed it immensely. They were creative, but they were still placing constraints on themselves, I think, without realizing that they were placing constraints on themselves. But their ambition for digital was, everybody has a laptop. And if you're looking at 2030, 2040, our level of ambition has to be more than that. Yeah. But we have to help our colleagues to understand what the art of the possible is. What's the world going to look like in 2030 or 2040? How are people going to operate? What does that mean for types of crime? What does that mean for how you might design a prison or another part of the justice system? So
you're stimulating people really to think years ahead, have a goal, have a vision on the future, and you're organizing a month to create the movement.
We are.
Etc.
To kick off a movement.
We talked a lot about change and movement. Pedro, you want to share with us a movie where some of the work you're doing, and I'm sure the change perspective is in there. 1 or 2 sentences to introduce the movie?
Yeah, it's actually a challenge similar to the one that Gina mentioned. So we're now, because we have this setup, we now need to move forward and making sure this kind of framework of working together in collaboration with startups really can be accelerated. So we've prepared just a small movie to show what will be. Now it's in preparation. You can see some information there.
The movie.
Over the last 20 years, the justice area in Portugal has undergone a significant shift towards delivering more efficient, transparent, and people-centered services. From the citizen card that gathered 5 different ID cards and can be used for online authentication and electronic signature, to the on-the-spot and online firm that made it possible to set up a company in a faster, paperless and convenient way, or the court's digital transformation through the electronic case management system. Several reforms have already been carried out with the purpose of delivering better access to justice. These shifts were enhanced by a strong collaboration between government, companies, universities and civil society, which we now want to widen and take forward. For instance, in Bupi, the Portuguese digital land registry platform, the GovTech ecosystem developed a mobile app that enables people to instantly start the registry process by recording the geographic coordinates of their lands. Also, as a result of the collaboration with a startup, we have launched an AI-driven generator for business names that relates them with the economic activity of the companies, making it easier and faster to choose an appropriate name. In courts, the automated anonymization of decisions currently being developed will foster transparency by making court decisions publicly available and will also facilitate judges' work by reducing search time. These machine learning systems enable better activity management, eliminate repetitive tasks, and improve the quality of services delivered to citizens and companies. As these projects are being developed, it's also time for the Portuguese Justice GovTech strategy to take one more step towards a closer collaboration with the ecosystem. The Justice Challenge invites startups, research centres and academia to answer to the justice sector needs with new, innovative projects. It's a close collaboration initiative to successfully overcome different challenges, from court digital transformation to the citizen and company registry lifecycle, from industrial property to the criminal investigation or the prison system. Visit govtech.justica.gov.pt and join us in tracing a new path for justice in Portugal.
We saw many justice leaders come to The Hague, and we see now here on stage real change makers. Thank you very much, Gina, Gill, Pedro, Tavares, for leading us to the future in the justice sector. The world needs you. And now, please, after applause for my 2 panelists.